Chuck Norris never once asked to be remembered, and that single fact tells you more about him than any film credit or martial arts title ever could. Every early morning he trained alone before the cameras arrived, every fight he won without an audience, every prayer he said quietly before bed when his body was worn down to its limit. None of it was performed for anyone. That was simply the man beneath the legend. And when March 19, 2026 arrived and the news broke across every screen in the world, the headlines reached for the usual language. An icon had fallen. Hollywood had lost its toughest man. But those words landed flat, because what actually ended that morning was not a brand or a cultural figure or an internet myth. What ended was a real life, lived in the small and daily ways that the public never saw. A wife who held his hand through hard nights. A husband who called home at 2 a.m. from the other side of the world just to ask how she was holding up. A man who saw something in a dream 10 days before he died, accepted it completely, and spent every hour that followed making sure the people he loved would be ready. Kauai held the funeral quietly, the way Chuck himself preferred to hold most things that mattered. A CNN reporter stood outside in a light rain and spoke carefully into her microphone, saying only that family and a small group of longtime friends had gathered inside for a private goodbye. No red carpet, no tribute reel, no crowd pressing forward. Inside, white lilies surrounded a simple wooden casket, and candles burned low on the altar. A photograph of Chuck rested on an easel near the front, and anyone expecting the famous squinting stare from 30 years of movie posters would have had to look twice. The photo showed him in his later years, gray hair short and neat, eyes steady and calm, a small private smile sitting at the corner of his mouth like a man who already knew how the story ended and found it acceptable. Gina O'Kelly sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap, breathing slowly through a morning that weighed more than most people carry in a lifetime. 28 years of marriage had given her a particular knowledge of this man, not the action films, not the martial arts championships, but the actual Chuck, the one who came home tired and still asked about her day before mentioning his own, the one who prayed softly in the dark when he thought she was already asleep. One of his oldest friends, a fellow martial artist, stood at the front and spoke in a low, rough voice about a man who always knew which fights deserved his energy and which ones didn't. When the words ran out, this man pressed one open hand flat against the casket for a long moment, then walked back to his seat with his head down. Scattered through the pews were faces the world of action cinema would have recognized instantly, though none of them wore that recognition anywhere visible that morning. Arnold Schwarzenegger sat straight but quiet, his usual commanding presence softened into something more personal. Dan Inosanto had his hands clasped tight in his lap, knuckles pale, lost somewhere in a long memory of shared training halls. Dolph Lundgren kept his arms folded and his jaw set, but his eyes had gone soft and far away. Jean-Claude Van Damme sat with his head bowed and his shoulders rounded. Former President George W. Bush held his hands on his knees and stared straight ahead without blinking, absorbing rather than deflecting. Not a single one of them arrived at that church as a public figure. Faith and friendship had pulled them there as plain human beings saying goodbye to one of their own. The minister stepped forward to close the service and spoke of rest and peace and a life of faith. And that's when Gina felt something she had been holding in place begin to give way. Chuck had always believed that quiet mattered more than noise, that most people spoke far more than the moment required. She had told herself she would honor that and let the service close the way he would have wanted, without fuss. But the memories came regardless, his hand covering hers through the nights that words couldn't reach. The late conversations about the children, about gratitude, about what they had built together. His voice praying quietly before sleep, unhurried, like a man talking to someone he had known his whole life. And the birthday, 10 days before everything changed, when something had shifted inside him so completely and so quietly that she had noticed it in real time and still not understood what it meant. Before the minister reached his final amen, she rose from her seat, walked forward until her fingers rested on the edge of the casket, then lifted her eyes to the room. She hadn't planned to speak, she told them. Chuck never wanted speeches, but letting the morning end without saying something true about the man she had loved for 28 years felt like a betrayal she couldn't live with. People had always asked whether Chuck was afraid of pain, of aging, of dying, and the answer she gave the room was plain and direct. He wasn't. Not at the end. But what mattered more than his lack of fear was the man who existed behind it, the one who came home every night and talked about simple things, the twins growing up, the gratitude he carried for the life they had made together. His body slowed down across those final years from decades of pushing it past what most men would attempt, and he said almost nothing about it. Every day ended the same way, with him asking whether she was holding up, making sure she came first before he addressed anything about himself. She looked directly at Arnold, at Dan, at Dolph, at Jean-Claude, at George, and told them they had seen that version of Chuck too. The man who canceled everything when a friend needed him, who prayed alongside you without making a production of it, who laughed at the old stories without ever using them to position himself above the people who had shared those years with him. That was the real Chuck, not the image, the man underneath it. His birthday landed 10 days before the end, and the family gathered at home for a quiet dinner, cake, presents, grandchildren filling the house with noise. And that's when Gina first noticed the stillness that had settled over him. Not sadness, not weakness. A depth of quiet she had never encountered in nearly 3 decades of knowing him. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, they sat together on the porch. Chuck took her hand and began telling her about a dream from the night before, speaking slowly and without hurry. He described a place filled entirely with light, not blinding, not cold, but warm in the specific way that makes fear simply impossible. Walking into it, he knew immediately that someone was waiting, and he knew without any uncertainty that it was the Lord. Not a distant figure of judgment, but presence, immediate and completely welcoming, and every weight he had carried across a lifetime left him at once. Standing in that light, he felt lighter than he had in years, with nothing but peace, whole and complete. His mother was there, not like a faint memory, real. She appeared the way she had looked when he was a boy, strong and warm, entirely herself, and she smiled at him with the recognition that only a mother carries. They didn't need much language between them. Being together was enough, and in that togetherness he understood something he said he had always believed, but now simply and irrevocably knew. Death was not an ending. Death was going home. He was not walking into anything alone. What stayed with Gina was not just the story itself, but his face while he was telling it. Peaceful in a way that was entirely new on him, as if something solid had been placed beneath him that no force could reach. After that birthday night, he canceled every obligation, meetings, appearances, commitments he had already agreed to. He told his manager simply that he needed to be home. For those last 10 days, the celebrity version of Chuck Norris, the martial arts icon, the action film star, the walker, Texas Ranger, none of it was present. What remained was her husband, their father, their grandfather. Walks in the yard with no destination, sitting on the couch while grandchildren climbed over him, laughing even when his back was hurting, pointing at flowers they had planted together years earlier, and talking quietly about how those same flowers would keep blooming long after both of them were gone. He held her hand more. He kissed her forehead more. He told her how much he loved her and how thankful he was for everything they had built, and he made sure the children heard it too, clearly and without rush. No loose ends, no words left unsaid. That is the thing about a man who has seen what's coming. He stopped saving anything for later. One evening near the end, they drove to the beach and sat together on a bench as the sun dropped over the water, the sky running orange and deep pink to the horizon. He put his arm around her, and they sat without speaking for a long time, and then he started talking quietly, saying he had a good run and more than most men ever get. He had fought hard and loved hard, and the Lord had been generous beyond anything he had earned. If his time was coming soon, he was ready, and he didn't want her worrying. He asked her to keep the family close, to not let the days run away, and to never let anyone say he went out afraid. Then he told her he loved her more that day than the day they married, and that he would love her tomorrow, wherever tomorrow turned out to be. They stayed until the light was entirely gone and nothing remained but the sound of the water. Standing at the front of that small church, Gina told the room she hadn't understood what he was doing in those moments. She had felt that unusual calm coming off him on his birthday, and told herself it was simply one of those rare, beautiful moments that arrive after enough shared years. The pieces only arranged themselves into a finished picture afterward, when looking back became the only direction available. Every quiet pause, every time he looked at her as if memorizing her face, every gentle word placed without hurry. He had known, and the Lord had given them 10 days, and she had not recognized the gift while her hands were holding it. Regret and love arriving together, which is how they almost always travel. But she would not let anyone leave that morning carrying regret on her behalf. He prepared the people he loved the way he did everything else, without wasted motion, without drama. Those 10 days were not lost. Every walk in the yard, every evening with the grandchildren, every word said slowly and with care. Those were the preparation. Keep the family close. Don't let the days run away. Hold your faith not just on Sunday mornings, but in the quiet nights when doubt sits down beside you and tries to stay. He left her with enough to keep standing, and that was entirely deliberate. What she asked of them was straightforward. She did not want anyone carrying away only the image of the day he died. Chuck would have wanted them to carry how he lived, the discipline that held even when no one was watching, the faith that never loosened its grip regardless of what the years brought, the steadiness he brought to everything that couldn't be changed or outworked. The man who came home every night, the father who showed up, the friend who never turned away. Behind all the action films, all the martial arts championships, all the celebrity mythology, there was a son who never stopped missing his mother, a husband who loved more deeply than he ever announced, a man whose faith walked with him all the way to the final step and left him not afraid, but grateful. She walked back to her seat, sat beside her children, reached for their hands, and held on. Nobody spoke. The candles burned low and steady. Outside, the rain had softened to almost nothing. What settled over the room was not only grief, though the grief was real and heavy. Alongside it sat something quieter and warmer, the understanding that Chuck had not been caught off guard, that a dream had shown him what was coming and he had accepted it completely, and that every hour after that acceptance had been spent making sure the people he loved were ready. Arnold rubbed a slow hand across his face. Dan lifted his head and let his eyes go distant. Dolph uncrossed his arms and let out a long breath. Jean-Claude raised his gaze and blinked hard. George eased the set of his shoulders by just a fraction. Chuck was gone. But how he had lived, how he had loved, how he had trusted, none of that was gone. All of it was right there in the room with them, in the story she had told, in the dream he had shared on a porch in the dark, in the peace he had carried all the way to the very last breath.